Okay, good morning, everybody. Good morning. Welcome to Infrastructure Week and Water Strong. We're here at the Newseum in the nation's capital to have a robust discussion about the value of water and the need to invest in its future. And it's a fitting time to be here during Infrastructure Week to talk about water infrastructure and water works. I'm Ben Grumbles. I'm president of the U.S. Water Alliance. More importantly, I'm part of this great coalition called the Value of Water Coalition. Let me say a few words about the coalition. A couple years ago, some visionary leaders in the private sector and the public sector realized that we need a coordinated voice, at least one clear, consistent voice on the value of water, and to spread that across the country, recognizing that all infrastructure is local, but there's also a need for local infrastructure to be connected to the greater good and the benefits that investments provide and to our national economy and the strength of our country. The Value Water Coalition is comprised of 6 leaders in the private sector: American, United, Veolia, Xylem, CH2M Hill, MWH Global, and 6 leaders in the water association world: American Water Works Association, Water Environment Federation, Association of Metropolitan Water Agencies, National Association of Clean Water Agencies, the National Association of Water Companies, and also the U.S. Water Alliance, which actually now we're not technically a member as much as we are a facilitator, coordinator on this great coalition. So we have put together a panel discussion on one of the most important topics of the day, and it's fitting that it's here in the Newseum, where we are, and millions of visitors every year are surrounded by the news and the headlines. One of the headlines you're not likely to see is water lines and treatment systems are working as they should be. And it's not because they aren't. They are. Water works. But because water infrastructure is forgotten and taken for granted, buried, out of sight and out of mind, it's so easy at the local level and certainly at the national level for us to lose sight of that. There are statistics, staggering numbers about the threat of a national crisis becoming a national catastrophe. So all of us today are joined in a discussion to be active and proactive. That's why the Value of Water Coalition is launching a public awareness campaign to help local leaders do more on the value of water and the need to invest in its future. One of the things that I find striking in the 2 minutes that I'm speaking here is that throughout the country, a water main break will occur during those 2 minutes. We lose 1.7 trillion gallons of drinking water a year. We lose hundreds of billions of gallons of wastewater each year because of the lack of a systematic, holistic approach and building the public support at the local level as needed. And we have local leaders who are part of the coalition. We have local leaders around the country, and I just want to assure everyone, as I look at good friends and great leaders in the audience and know that there are also great leaders who are listening in and watching by webcast, the Value of Water Coalition is not meant to be the be-all and end-all. We recognize that this coalition will grow, but we think it's great when you have 6 public and 6 private organizations coming together on the value of water and the need to invest in its future. The last thing I want to say is that there are some cards that are being passed out to those of you in the audience for some questions, possible Q&A we have with this dynamic, exciting panel. And I'm going to turn it over now to Cathleen Kelly with Center for American Progress. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben. Let me start by introducing myself, and then I'll let the panel introduce them, and we'll kick off the discussion. I'm Cathleen Kelly. I'm a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. Before joining the center, I was at the White House Council on Environmental Quality, where I worked with the administration to develop the president's climate preparedness and resilience strategies. I was also at the German Marshall Fund of the United States before that, directing the climate and energy program there.
Me.
Yes.
Good morning. My name is Ed Pinero. I'm the Senior Vice President for Sustainability and Public Affairs for Veolia North America. We're a large, very large infrastructure and service provider. I am a earth scientist and geologist by education and background, and I spent the last 3.5 decades in private sector and public sector doing environmental management issues, energy, and sustainability.
Morning, George Hawkins, General Manager of DC Water, serves this building and the entire region, water, wastewater, and stormwater. I've had a 25-year career where I haven't ever been able to keep a job for very long. I've worked on the nonprofit side, the academic side. I've been a government official, and I ran the city agency that used to regulate DC Water prior to my current job.
Hi, good morning. I'm Ken Kopocis. I'm a senior advisor at EPA. I guess I'm there, unlike George, I'm there because I can't get a job. Most of my life I worked up on Capitol Hill in the water and the infrastructure world, both from a water quality standpoint and from a water development standpoint.
Good morning. My name is Mark Strauss. I'm the Senior Vice President of Strategy and Business Affairs, Business Development at American Water, and we are the largest investor-owned water and wastewater company in the United States. And full disclosure, I'm a lawyer in recovery. Of the people on this panel, I'm the least technically qualified, and I came into water through project, mostly in wastewater and a lot of water reuse. And it's a very worthy topic of consideration. So, Tony.
Good morning. I'm Tony Parrott, and I'm the Executive Director of the Greater Cincinnati Waterworks and the Metropolitan Sewer District of Greater Cincinnati, and also responsible for stormwater management. So we're a truly integrated utility serving not only the city of Cincinnati, but Hamilton County, and we provide drinking water to northern Kentucky, and we serve a population of about 1.1 million folks. I've got about 29 years of experience in the public sector, 20 years as a utility director, both at the medium-sized utility and also now with a larger metropolitan district, and so we're very excited to be a part of this.
As you can see, we have an outstanding panel here today, and I'm delighted to be here as your moderator. I want to thank all of you in the audience for joining us today, and also want to thank those who are watching via webcast. I think this conversation is incredibly timely, not only because it's Infrastructure Week here in Washington, but we actually have a big challenge with our water infrastructure. While this critical infrastructure is often invisible, it is absolutely vital for our daily lives, for our families, for our community, for our public health and safety, for our industry, and for our local economies. Yet this critical infrastructure is in desperate need of repair. At the same time, it is also facing increasing risks from climate change. Last week, the President released the National Climate Assessment, which was a comprehensive study written by over 300 scientists across the country that concluded every corner of our country is going to be impacted by climate change. And there's particular risks with that for water infrastructure in the South and in the Northwest. We're going to see increased drought and dry spells. That is going to be a tremendous challenge for our water infrastructure, increasing water competition and scarcity. And then across the country, we're going to see much more precipitation, heavy downpours that are really threatening our water quality, increasing the amount of sediment that flows into our rivers and streams, and also increases the contamination in our water. So these are huge risks. Fortunately, we have an outstanding panel to talk about these and many other issues. I want to thank the panel for joining us. And I also just want to note that everyone on the panel is representing themselves here today. George, I want to start the conversation with you. Here in Washington, D.C., you're at the front lines of infrastructure, water infrastructure, and you know better than anyone the challenges that we see not only here in Washington with the water infrastructure, but across the country. Can you talk to us a little bit about those challenges?
Sure. I remember one of the calls I got on the bat phone. The bat phone is the phone that the mayor calls you on and the council members call you on, and you have it on you 24 hours a day. This call came through late on a Sunday night of Labor Day weekend 2 years ago. And I lived at the time down by the ballpark, which is south of the Capitol, and I had a floor-to-ceiling window that looked north to the city. And the call was that there was severe flooding in a particular neighborhood of Washington, D.C. No rainfall was falling at all in my neighborhood just to the south. But I could see the incredibly dark clouds, and it looked like an edge to them that was just to the north. I ran out, hopped into my car, which is a Volt, by the way. I was a little nervous about driving into a flood in an electric car. I jumped into my Volt, I drove uptown, and I was there pretty quickly because it was just cross town and no one else was driving at this point. And we had, what had happened is so much rainfall had happened in such a short duration that we have combined sewers in Washington, like 750 cities in the United States. And the combined sewage line, which is actually huge, it starts at 7 feet in diameter and ends at 22 feet in diameter when it gets down to the Anacostia River. So much stormwater had flowed into it that it filled. If you're near the river, that allows an overflow to the river, which is a terrible outcome, but better than the alternative, which is it flowing back into homes and streets. But in the center of the city, the only overflows, they do in fact overflow to the streets and the houses, and that's exactly what had happened. The sewer lines become like water mains when they're filled to that level. They become pressurized, and they start pushing this combination of sewage and wastewater back into the system. And we had sewage going into basements throughout this neighborhood. We had so much flow on Rhode Island Avenue, which is not that far north in the city, that a car was floating down the street and their driver had to be rescued. Well, we started looking into what is the problem in this neighborhood. There's one main sewer line. It's called the Northeast Boundary Trunk Sewer that runs all the way across Florida Avenue. For those who are not in Washington, D.C., if you think of the city as the famous diamond, it's not that far up the city where Florida cuts across. That's called the Northeast Boundary Trunk Sewer because when it was installed in 1890, Florida Avenue was the northeast boundary of Washington, D.C. Prior to there being any cars, any mode of the transportation other than horses, no one lived north of that because it would take too long to get down into the center of the city. So the main sewer line, the largest sewer shed in Washington, D.C., is served by a sewer that was installed 120 years ago. That's the challenge that cities all over the country face. We have infrastructure that was installed. I've got water mains above White House that were put in before the Civil War. Our average age of our unlined cast iron water mains, which are our biggest trouble because they corrode and we have all sorts of brown water issues. Median age of our unlined cast iron water mains, 750 miles of them in Washington, D.C., is 96 years old. And I'm not a math person, but median to me, they tell me, means that half of the pipes in the city are older than that, and half are younger than 96 years old. It's an unbelievable characteristic that this essential service has that kind of age. Now, just to give you a sense of the challenge of replacing and getting up to date, according to US EPA, the average replacement of capital infrastructure by most authorities is about 0.5% a year. 0.5% of your capital infrastructure. That's a 200-year replacement cycle. In DC, when I started as GM 5 years ago, it was 1/3 of 1% a year. That's a 300-year replacement cycle. That's a 300-year replacement cycle built on the back of 100-year-old median age infrastructure. That's a 400-year. It's untenable at its core. What I've been able to do over the last 5 years is triple our capital replacement in Washington, D.C. We're now at 1% of replacement. But the challenge to all of us is the price and the cost. When I arrived at DC Water, the average single family cost per month was about $40 a month. I have tonight a rate hearing, the final of 9 that I do all myself. I have 2 police officers accompany me because some of these are pretty tough. We are making a proposal that, if accepted, will be an $88 per month average single family bill. It's more than doubled in 5 years. We've projected out 20 years of what it's going to take us in order to get the infrastructure in the capital city to where it ought to be, and we have above inflation increases projected 20 years in advance. So the challenge of this extraordinarily important infrastructure, aged to an extent that's almost mind-boggling, and the financial needs in order to update and improve it, is one that's really an incredible feature of modern society.
Thanks so much, George. I'm going to turn now to you, Tony. I'd love to hear about what's happening in Cincinnati, but also I wanted you to reflect a little bit on the report that was published for this event, Invisible to Invaluable, which is a report that's on this event website. The report talks about how the public sees the value in clean water, we drink it every day, but doesn't necessarily connect the value of clean water to wastewater treatment facilities and other water infrastructure. Can you talk a little bit about this challenge and some of the things that you and others in the industry are doing across the nation to help increase public awareness of the value of water?
Well, I think this coalition is a good way to start. You have members that are involved that have done a great job in terms of the campaign. But I think the challenges that we face with our urban core communities is a very critical message. We have population decline, we have blighted communities, we have infrastructure, as George mentioned, that is very old. And when you think about the major cities across America, we're all under federal programs to replace that infrastructure to comply with unfunded mandates. And so what type of investments are we going to be making? And how are we going to make sure that people understand that the investments we make are really an opportunity for us to bring value to the communities that we serve? For example, last fall we had a discussion with about 20 general managers across the country. And with those 20 general managers, the cities that we serve, we collectively are going to be spending about $12 billion a year. $12 billion a year in terms of our operating budget and our capital budget. So what does that mean in terms of big business? Water utility is a big business. And so when you think about the message that we need to start to get out there, it's really about what is the value and what is the benefit to the communities that we serve. Aging infrastructure is one that, over the next 20 years, when you think about what it means to the country, is significant. If we don't take the opportunity now to think about how water and wastewater and stormwater infrastructure can benefit us, we're going to miss the opportunity to take advantage of creating approximately 700,000 jobs over the next 20 years and increasing the gross domestic product for the nation for about $600 billion. And so it's a critical discussion. And so how do you make people understand that what they can't see below ground is that valuable? So one of the things that we're trying to do with the message, and not only in Cincinnati, but across the country, is how do we make sure that we are bringing value and we're bringing community benefits? And how do we make sure that folks understand the importance of clean water? An example of clean water versus wastewater, in Ohio, for example, our source water is the Ohio River. And some of you may have followed earlier this year, there was a spill in the Elk River in West Virginia that ultimately matriculated down the Ohio River. And so we were fortunate in Cincinnati that we were able to have the ability to close our intakes for about 30 hours and let the spill go by and not impact our drinking water. But we do have a drinking water system, treatment system, which is the best in the country from our perspective, and we could have handled the spill, but we chose to shut our intakes. So the value of being able to have an infrastructure in place to be able to save the public from a spill is something that I think is a part of the conversation. As far as the Ohio River is concerned, also when you think about the source water, 90% of our drinking water comes from the Ohio River. Upstream, we have other communities that have combined sewer overflows. There's stormwater runoff, and that makes up a great mass balance of the Ohio River. So wastewater treatment also is a very important aspect of what we do. And so water treatment and wastewater treatment is probably the greatest gift that we have within our communities, and as people have said before, water is life and infrastructure makes it happen. So one of the things that I think is very important is that we understand that unless we invest in the infrastructure that we are using to serve the community at this point, I think the American Society excuse me, of Engineers reported that the grade of our infrastructure, water and wastewater, is at a D. It's a letter grade of a D. And I'm not a rocket science, but I think that's one letter grade above an F. So, we're at a critical state, and I think that we need to pay attention to what's happening, and we need to continue to collaborate not only with the associations and not only with the other utilities, but we need to do a better job of elevating the conversation here in Washington, D.C., And as a community, we have to bring forth a message that will allow folks to graduate their minds to a higher level of understanding on how critical water and wastewater and stormwater infrastructure investments are and what it means to them and in their communities. And I think that is part of the strategy that we need to employ.
Great. Thanks so much, Tony. I want to ask you a quick follow-up question. A couple months ago, for the Center for American Progress, I wrote a report called Climate Change, an Unfunded Mandate. And since you mentioned unfunded mandates, I wanted to ask you a question about this. In the report, we highlight Grand Rapids, Michigan, a city in the Midwest like yours, which is facing much more heavy downpours and increased precipitation that is creating huge challenges for the sewage system. And so the city is now forced to make very expensive upgrades to the sewage system. I'd love to hear if you're facing similar challenges like that in Cincinnati.
Yes, we are. I think one of the things that is driving a lot of the programs and a lot of the projects that we're doing in the Midwest is, of course, in our combined sewer systems. And when it rains, it pours. And so in Cincinnati, our combined sewer overflows obviously is something that we're focused on, because it's really, our combined sewer overflow is probably the 5th largest in the nation. And so how do you make sure that you're attacking that in a way that you're meeting the requirements that are put in for you from the US EPA or the Clean Water Act, but also doing it in a way that you're bringing investment to the communities? And so one of the projects that we're working on is our Lick Run project. It's a project that is being done in a community where we had seen over the last 10 years a 55% decline in population. We also have seen unemployment rate of about 36% in a mile stretch of a community where we have to do a major investment. And so we started an approach that was less, probably different than the conventional approach, and working with US EPA and working with others to come up with a more sustainable investment, an investment that would achieve the objectives under the consent decree, but bring forth an amenity or an asset that would bring the historical wealth of water to the surface by creating a natural conveyance system that would also offload stormwater from the existing combined sewer system and create a community asset that ultimately, once our work is done as a public utility, it would influence maybe private side, or what I would like to call private side action or private side investments that will create jobs, rebuild communities, and spark revitalization. And so I think there's a blend or a marriage of how we invest our infrastructure to make it sustainable and make it something that's going to be a benefit and a value to the communities that we're serving.
Great, thanks so much, Tony. Ken, I want to turn to you from EPA. Over the course of your very impressive career, you've worked on a whole range of infrastructure issues. I think one of the challenges with water infrastructure is it's often this forgotten infrastructure. Can you talk a bit about how water infrastructure differs from, say, transportation infrastructure?
Oh, thank you. Yes, I very much agree with that statement, that water infrastructure has often been the stepchild of infrastructure investment. And it's really been one of the great mysteries, I think, for all of us who work and live in the water world. I think that when people think of public works investment and they think of infrastructure investment, they so often think of on the surface. And as you said, highways and transit, and I guess even to another extent, investments in aviation infrastructure. And my personal speculation is a variety of reasons associated with that. I think not insignificant, of course, is that you can see, touch, and feel that which is above the surface. George's infrastructure, you only really realize what it is when you turn on the tap or when it's somehow backed up in your basement, right? So there's a real problem there. I think that it's been not lost on the community that one of the advantages that other forms of infrastructure have, at least at the federal level, is that they do have a self-financing mechanism for federal participation. And that has been an issue that has been needed to be addressed in how we are going to make these investments. I think also that, again, I'll speak at the federal level, that in my work, particularly up on Capitol Hill, Members of Congress see, feel this surface infrastructure all the time. I'll focus or mention particularly like aviation infrastructure. There are 535 members of Congress. Very few of them commute by car, rail, or other surface transportation. They commute by air. And they know the aviation industry. They live the aviation industry. We once had a hearing on the size of seats and legroom on airplanes. I'm sure the public was extremely concerned about that. But I'm guessing there were some 500 individual users that were very concerned about that and could lean on the industry to try to do something about it. I think that, in many respects, water infrastructure has been investment has been a victim of its own success. When George outlines that the median age of his pipes is well over 90 years, it still works. I mean, in some respects, that's the problem, is that it still works as well as it does. I think that people only really notice when there are catastrophic failures, when there's a boil water alert, when there's a huge pipe that breaks. When River Road becomes its namesake and is in fact a river. So that's when people notice that there's a problem. People expect it to work, and it's been successful in working. I think that the public values that which it knows and which it's aware of. I think that we all have an obligation to make people aware. I think that people are anxious to help us in that arena, in that people are returning to their cities. They're looking at their infrastructure. They're realizing the investments that need to be made. In this particular area, Lyndon Johnson famously called the Potomac River an open sewer, and now there are bass tournaments held in the Potomac. We're not finished. There are still issues of whether you should eat those bass that you catch in that river. But for most people, it's fine. But if you're immune deficient or an expectant mother, maybe not your daily intake. But people, as I said, they're looking at their water and the investments that we make that impact all of their lives. As people return to their cities, they want to know that they can return to their waterfront. The District of Columbia is just one of many communities that is investing heavily in its waterfront and the investments in its waterfront. Over the many years I spent on Capitol Hill, we had hundreds of communities come in and look for our help to try to revitalize waterfronts. People are investing in their waterfronts. Grand Rapids came up. You mentioned Grand Rapids in their investment. Grand Rapids is also looking quite significantly to restore the rapids that are in Grand Rapids as part of their renewal program in downtown Grand Rapids. In EPA, we want to explore ways to enhance that kind of investment. It's no secret that our federal investment for water and wastewater infrastructure has been declining over the many years, both in actual terms and, of course, in inflation-adjusted terms. But that's not that we're abandoning the program by any means. It continues to be a priority of the administration. I think most recently it was reflected as a large influx of money in response to Hurricane Sandy, and or before that, a large influx of money as part of the Recovery Act. But obviously there are pressures on discretionary spending. I think that we also need to realize that we're faced with a fundamental societal question in terms of investing in infrastructure. We are living off of the investments that our parents, our grandparents, our great-grandparents, and I guess in Georgia, and great-grandparents, and I guess in Georgia, the founding fathers made in our infrastructure. And those investments were made at a time when it was perceived to be a national priority to make those investments. We live in a different and more complex world today. When those investments were made 70, 80, 90, 100 years ago, we didn't have the societal investments that we make today, whether it be in social programs or education, et cetera, that we make at the federal level. At that time, the investments that the nation made in our national defense were different and consumed a different part of the government. I'm not mentioning any of this to criticize our current spending plan. I think it's just in a public awareness that we need to make sure that we raise the profile of the need for these investments, the various benefits that are associated with these investments, and it's not just about moving water, it's quality of life is really what we're talking about. This is an opportunity at this point. Money's at historically low rates if people want to make investments, but people have to want to make those investments.
Great. Thanks, Ken. I want to turn now to Mark Strauss from American Water. Mark, a lot of people don't necessarily think of the water industry as being particularly innovative, but in fact there's a lot happening, a lot of really great ideas that are bubbling up, particularly in communities that are facing high risks of heavy downpours and even drought brought on by climate change. Can you talk to us a little bit about some of those innovations and how investments in those innovations can actually help our economy?
Sure. Before I get into that, a little thought experiment. If the challenge that we face in infrastructure, one of the basic issues is paying for it, and the value that the public, whether it be our customer or other parts of the public who are asked to contribute through taxes or other mechanisms. And I think one of the challenges we have is that we're talking about renewal and maintenance of the infrastructure that exists. If you lived in a community where you had to go out, walk 5 miles to get a bucket of water, or you did not have indoor plumbing, and somebody showed up at your door and said, for the price of $100 a month, you can now have indoor plumbing, running water, and sanitation, you'd probably take that bet. George is going out trying to convince people to pay $88 a month when they're used to paying far less. And we've been trading on our existing infrastructure, and we've basically been victims of our own success. So how do you attack that issue to keep and get the public trust and in fact enhance it? And innovation is one of the routes to help get that done. I think there's 3 buckets you can think about innovation. Usually when you hear the word, you think about technology, and that's a big chunk of it. But I think there's also, and I'll get to that in a minute, but there's also innovation in terms of just how we think about water. Water has traditionally been thought of as clean water, wastewater, and stormwater. And one of the efforts that our coalition is trying to really enhance is you have to think about it as one water. Wastewater is, even that word is a misnomer. If you think about it differently, that type of water has a lot of value to it if it's handled correctly. Traditionally, it was just get it out of my mind, get it out of here. Solution's the solution, just get rid of it. But there's a lot of energy value in it, there's a lot of nutrient value in it, and we need to think about, if we're going to be economically sound, if we're going to be sustainable, we have to think about water differently. So, for instance, stormwater, approaches to stormwater, whether it be CSOs or just building big pipes to get it out of town. Now we're starting to think about it in terms of green infrastructure, rain gardens, rooftop gardens, a lot of things that will recapture that water and recharge it into the aquifers. Other aspects of thinking about it are, as we approach the planning for water, we should take an integrated approach instead of a water utility thinking only about the water supply, thinking about an integrated water resource management planning technique. And that's, the industry is coming to do that. And George and Tony represent agencies that have gotten all of those components into their frame of reference, into their business unit, if you will, and they're dealing with them. So we have to think about it differently. Then there's business combinations. Traditionally, there was the public sector that ran a lot of our purveyors and suppliers, and then there were firms such as American Water that was investor-owned. We provide water and wastewater services literally from coast to coast, serve over 15 million people. So we see our sister agencies, we see all the different climate changes, all the different challenges. So how do we partner instead of thinking of ourselves in completely different worlds? How do we work together because the challenge is so great? Are there business combinations that can bring capital to bear? Public-private partnerships is a very popular term now. It's kind of an elastic term that's usually used. Can be used if you're selling me gravel to a public agency, to a concession to run a system. But it does mean, how do you work together to mutual benefit? And there are a lot of work going on in that regard, whether it be long-term leases, whether it be design, build, finance, whether it be some of the things that George has done around the residuals management. It's being done. We don't notice it a lot of times, but we're being compelled by efficiency and sustainability to think about that more holistically and look at those different business models. And then back to technology. That is probably the most exciting part, the type of things that get the most press. And there are a lot of things going on. Wastewater treatment for years was pretty standard. In the old days, it was you just let things settle out and hope for the best and pump the water over the side. Then we went to biological treatment, disinfection, and now membrane filtration has been coming into the market over the last 10 to 20 years. and is getting more accepted and more efficient. You also see technical innovation in water supply. Again, some membranes are used to filter water. Desalination of water is becoming more widespread. The United States doesn't do much of it now compared to the rest of the world, but we are being compelled by climate change and other supply challenges to get more, to do it more. And in that regard, in the old days, if you were going to desalinate water, you literally distilled it. And that took a lot of energy to boil it off. And then you went to membranes, reverse osmosis. And over the last 20 years, the cost of operation of those membranes due to technological improvements has come way down. So those are kind of the things that technologically are exciting. In American Water, and I know DC Water does a lot of this too, we've intentionally set up innovation programs. We call ours the Innovation Development Program, where we seek out technologies, and because our social contract is that we will provide safe, reliable, efficient service, you can understand why the culture tends to be conservative. You do not want to gamble with the health and safety of the people served by our systems. But that said, there's a lot of room for innovation. And it can be in things such as metering. In the old days, meters, you got read once a month or once a quarter, and they were just mechanical things spinning away. With new metering technologies, they can capture a lot of data that you can use to analyze the functioning of your system, notify customers about leaks, and detect leaks in the system outside of the customer's homes. So those types of things are going on all the time, and there will be more of them. Some of them proprietary. Our scientists have developed a couple of things that we've had patented, one around wastewater, which we call NP Express, that saves energy. Veolia has a portfolio of patents, and many others do as well. Again, because it's buried infrastructure, a lot of times you don't tend to notice it, but the driver to be sustainable and affordable, that technology is being absorbed more and more into the organizations that provide the service.
Great. Thanks so much, Mark. We still have lots more panel discussion to go, but I wanted to just mention to the audience that there are cards that are being passed about to gather your questions when we get to that stage of the conversation. And then folks who are watching on the webcast can also send their questions and comments in via Twitter with the handle @thevalueofwater and the hashtag #thevalueofwater. Let me turn to Ken really quickly again before I get to you, Ed. Ken, I would love it if you could talk to us a little bit more about the risks of climate change to our water infrastructure. I think a lot of people across the country don't necessarily realize the vulnerability of our water infrastructure as we see more heavy downpours and droughts. And of course we have the National Climate Assessment, which was released last week. Perhaps you could share some of the highlights of that and talk a little bit about what EPA is doing to help communities better prepare for the impacts of climate change.
Well, thank you. You're absolutely right. I think that people have to have a full understanding of the impacts on climate. And this is a debate, or I shouldn't call it a debate. This is a discussion that needs to be had, irrespective of your views as to what might be causing the climate change and increased temperature changes in the United States and across the world. Because the impacts are there, and the impacts are noticeable, and they're noticeable today. I think that was one of the big elements of the assessment that people really needed to take from that. The assessment clearly demonstrates that we believe that the first and foremost place that people will observe in their daily lives effects from climate change will be in the water world. And it's going to vary depending on where you are and how water impacts you most immediately. But the assessment clearly showed that the number of precipitation events and the severity of precipitation events will increase, and ironically, drought will simultaneously increase. And probably even more ironically, both the precipitation events that will cause flooding and the drought can occur in the same areas because of the intensity of the events that occur combined with the infrequency of those events occurring. The number of short-term droughts is likely to go up, and the number of long-term droughts long-term droughts will get longer. As I mentioned, there will be the potential for more flooding, even with less precipitation. There will be seriously altered water demands and availability. Water availability, of course, can change based on drought and flood, But water demands is also another key component of this, and that is that as temperatures rise, you have higher rates of evapotranspiration, so you have water that may not reach a stream or a lake. You have water demands from the growing plants that are in the vicinity. We all know about the impacts on sea level rise. You need to go no farther than Miami Beach when they have what they call, I believe it's sunshine flooding, when there's not a cloud in the sky and the streets are flooded. And it's simply because of high tides and their proximity to the ocean combined with sea level rise. Storm surges are going to be more severe everywhere, because when you start with a higher level, all you need to do is add another couple of feet, and now your 2-foot storm surge is a 3-foot storm surge. And many coastal areas are not prepared for that. Coastal water supplies are imperiled, because again, as the water level rises, it puts more pressure on the freshwater resources that people rely. Again, Florida is a classic example. Floridians have to pump millions and billions of gallons of water into their aquifers to keep the salt water out. Increased air temperature. As many of you may remember from science, as the air temperature goes up, its capacity to hold water goes up. It leads back into the idea that what we're going to see is we're going to see more severe storms when those storms occur. Many of the communities, of course, along the coastal areas are going to be particularly vulnerable to climate change and sea level rise. But it's not just those communities. People are feeling it in other areas of the country as well. Last summer, Administrator McCarthy was out in Iowa at the Iowa State Fair, an event everybody should do at least once in their life.
Even if you're not running for president?
Even if you're not running for president. If nothing else, you've never seen rabbits or pigs as big as they have them there. And as she says, they also have the world's best pork chops. They're famous pork on a stick, which I think is healthier than a fried Snickers bar on a stick. But the real point I wanted to make is that as she was visiting with farmers out there, you know, you don't have to have a discussion on climate change and the causes of climate change. What you have is a discussion of people who live and die economically based on what happens in the skies. And they know that their weather patterns are different. Yeah. A farmer who's been farming in Iowa for 50 years knows that his precipitation patterns are different and his water demands have changed. He wants to address that today. And he needs to address that today to stay economically viable. So I think that as I said, climate change is a big discussion here in Washington, but its impacts on our water supplies and our water use and how water impacts us on a daily basis is here, it's now, it's today.
Thanks so much, Ken. And you mentioned sea level rise. Of course, we saw earlier this week a new study that's showing that the Antarctic ice sheet is actually incredibly vulnerable and is now starting to break apart. This is one of those tipping points that scientists hope would not happen. And this, of course, is going to have a dramatic impact on sea level rise and really threaten coastal communities, coastal infrastructure, including water infrastructure. Let me turn now to you, Ed Pinero from Veolia, North America. Ed, can you talk to us a little bit more about the potential risks of actually failing to invest in upgrades to our water infrastructure, this critical infrastructure that we all rely on daily, and even some of the risks that we face in a changing climate without those upgrades?
Right, okay, well, good morning again. I want to preface the response to that question a little bit in the context of what you've heard so far. I was born and raised in the Bronx. I'm an inner city kid, and to me, water infrastructure was a faucet in the toilet. And I was a dirty kid. I was interested in science and technology from the very beginning, and I never thought beyond the faucet in the toilet in terms of the water infrastructure. So part of one of the implications of not investing is that's how you end up, the raising of awareness ends up happening in an unfortunate situation, where the only time awareness and interest comes from the general public is something bad happens. So one of the early steps to alleviate one of these implications is understanding the importance of this. We're a global company. I do a lot of water-related activities around the world. It's amazing how many people in other countries have this perception that North America has a perfect water structure, perfect distribution system, everything works. Why are you even talking about investing in that water infrastructure? We should be building new infrastructure systems in different parts of the world. There's just a lack of understanding of this. So in terms of the impacts and the concerns of not investing, well, one is very immediate, and you've heard this. Tony and George are the best ones to talk about some of these frontline issues. You see the ruptured water pipes, the boil water alerts, the flooding of alerts, very immediate. You've heard Ben mention 1.7 trillion gallons of water is lost due to the failing infrastructure. I did a little math last night. That's enough water to supply everybody in the Baltimore, Washington metropolitan area for a year and a half. And that's just water that just is getting lost in the system. So as graphic as that is, there are certain things that are kind of lurking in the darkness that are potential implications of not investing. First of all, realizing that only 14% of our fresh water is out of the infrastructure is used for domestic use and drinking. The other 86% goes into manufacturing, industry, and agriculture. So when you talk about failing infrastructure and lost resource, yes, it's the home, it's the residents, but it's also industry, it's commerce, and it's our entire food supply. So that's when you heard comments about jobs and impacts to GDP and so on, that's what's happening. It's because this infrastructure is supporting so many different elements. So let me just quickly touch on three areas. One is, it was already alluded to in the previous question about climate-related implications. And you've heard a lot mentioned already about the impacts from climate change. From an infrastructure perspective, what does that mean in terms of investment? We talk about investing in infrastructure. It's more than fixing the leaks and fixing the problems. It's new infrastructure. It's new changing patterns. If drought patterns change and water supply changes, that moves people, it moves industry, and it moves agriculture. And with it, the infrastructure has to follow. So when we talk about infrastructure investment to keep up with what's happening, you have to overlay that. It's not a matter of just going back and fixing what's already there. It's moving things around. Very graphic example of this is in Tampa, switching from surface water to groundwater because of the saltwater incursion. That changes the infrastructure. That's different treatment systems, that's different piping systems. So even if everything works fine, if you have to switch a source, that has an implication in long-term investment. One other point on this issue about climate, we partnered with Columbia University to do a study on drought issues. And one of the things that's forgotten a lot is that if you have a drought year, if the next year is fine, unless it's fine enough to make up the deficit from the drought, you're still a little bit behind. And if you have this accumulating drought, you get deceived thinking, okay, that was 2 years ago and everything's okay now, but your resource may be deficient because it didn't make up that. And what's interesting about that, when you list the cities, when you correct the water supply picture for that accumulating deficit, the #1 city in the country that has that risk is Washington, D.C. And you wouldn't have thought about that. But when you look at that pattern of risk, it's one of the areas that scored very high. So again, thinking about this to drive the investment. Another thing, the second point has to do with going back to this issue of industry and manufacturing. We tend to think of them as different systems. In other words, we have the domestic supply and that infrastructure, and somewhere over there, there's all these factories and they're using water, and yes, they have infrastructure needs, but they're over there and we're over here. And in reality, that's not the case. Many of these industries, many of these operations, many of these manufacturing are within the same systems that we're talking about in this discussion. So when you talk about impact and need for investment, that's how you figure in that economic implication. I think there's a silver lining to that cloud because that introduces the possibility of a different kind of public-private partnership. You know, we talk about those in the context of private water companies and municipalities, but there's opportunities for Shell Oil to partner with a city and Pfizer to partner with a community to improve infrastructure because they are using that same infrastructure. They're depending on it. The third area I wanted to comment to close on this point, and that is, in terms of potential impacts of not investing in the water infrastructure, is when water is wasted, energy is wasted. One of the biggest costs and one of the biggest footprints of dealing with water is the energy that goes along with it. For our operations, after labor, the next largest cost is energy, and everything else is a distant third and beyond. So when you talk about an infrastructure that has problems and is not as efficient as it can be, there's a cost associated with that, and you have a secondary cost associated with the energy that goes along with it. I was at a conference here in DC on Monday talking about the implications to electricity rates as a result of emission requirements on the power industry. And those are pass-through costs. So the more electrons that have to be pushed through those wires, the more it's going to cost. And so it's sad that we're pushing gallons into the infrastructure that get lost, and we pay for it. And we're pushing electrons through the wires that get lost, and we pay for it. So, so I think all those points kind of come together to give this this picture that, and when we come back around to the panel, I think there's a good story here. I'm an optimist, not a pessimist, and I painted a very sad picture there. But we have to realize that when we talk about the issue of the infrastructure and investment, there's many elements to it, and it's an iceberg, and the tip of that iceberg is the leaks and the floods and the boil water events, but there's a huge thing underneath there that of other potential impacts that need to be dealt with. But there's answers out there. I feel they are.
Thanks for that optimism, Ed. Let's go back to the front lines here in Washington, D.C. and in Cincinnati. And I want to turn to George and Tony again to have you each talk a little bit more about how your utilities are preparing for the future, especially a future that is going to involve climate change and serious risks to our infrastructure. Tell us a little bit about what some of the changes we can expect to see in our water infrastructure over the next decade or so. Maybe start with you, George. Yeah.
Sure. I also, no one in this industry can be anything other than an optimist. It would be hard otherwise. But I want to thank again the U.S. Water Alliance and the Value of Water Coalition for hosting this event. I do recommend From Invisible to Invaluable, the document that was produced to coincide with this. It's a great short read. It doesn't take long, but it creates a case statement that I think is very well done, and I commend it. I'm also really pleased to be on this panel. I love what Tony's doing in Cincinnati. I consider myself the kleptocrat in chief, and I will take an idea as long as it's moral and ethical and not breaking any laws. I'll borrow it. And Cincinnati is one of the places I always go. We directly work with Veolia all the time. They're helping us in DC, and Veolia, and I just visited American Water up in Voorhees about our innovations. And of course EPA. There's no more important enterprise for us than EPA, but great to be here. The extraordinary opportunity, and the reason that I sort of staked my whole career in coming into DC Water is actually all on the upside. I don't think there is a better product or a better industry to be in, bar none, than water. When people ask me, Mr. Hawkins, how many jobs do you support? I totally agree with Tony that emphasizing the job creation and support we can give to our cities and those people who need jobs is great. But when I answer the job question, I always say all of them. There's not a job in the United States that a water system doesn't support. Every single job. If you do not have water into a building, it cannot get a certificate of occupancy. It cannot have anyone in there making a business. It helps everyone. How many lives do you support? I always say all of them. And I don't just mean human. There's no living organism in anywhere on this planet that doesn't rely on clean water for its life cycle. So we support every job, we support every organism, and we support how much foodstuffs do you support? All of them. There's how much energy do you support? All of it. There's no part of the economy that we aren't fundamentally instrumental to. And to add a second point, we connect to everybody. Everyone in Washington, D.C. gets something from DC Water every month, and they have to open it. And that means we have a connection to every household, and it's a connection to something that's fundamental to them. So the upside gain for a product that is so connected to everything else is really extraordinary. And I say 4 areas of change. I'll give you the 4 areas, and I'll give you an example of each one. First is having this extraordinary product, marketing it and presenting it to the public we serve. It's an incredible opportunity. You look at the logo I have on my shirt here, DC with a water drop, water is life is our phrase. We used to have a logo. I used to wear my uniform around, and people thought I worked for the corrections department. I don't know why, but it was sort of a standard DC, had a diamond, red, white, and blue, and all, but you couldn't tell what it was. We've changed our logo to make it visible and easy to see. We're on Facebook, YouTube, Pinterest, Twitter. We have an incredibly active Twitter account. We're finding it incredibly easy to communicate with our customers and that they're fascinated. We run this gigantic waste treatment plant, yet we are booked for reservations to come visit it through the fall. We can't keep up with all the people who are, when they hear about it, they're like, that's fascinating, I never knew. So we've got this incredible product. I'll give you one more example. I see Nicole Condon, my compatriot from DC Water. We just spent the Nationals ballpark. We have Wendy the Water Drop. We have a mascot. We had, as anyone who watches baseball knows, the President's Race, these big mascots of the President's Race. Well, we had Wendy the Water Drop at the Nationals ballpark for Drinking Water Week. People were coming up to our table, and it was amazing how interested they were once we made the connection. So one is we've got a fantastic product, and there's so much upside on how to present it. Second is technical innovation. There are extraordinary things being done on the technical side. I agree there's a resistance to change, and to me that comes from the notion we're 24/7, 24 hours, 365, with a product that is almost never thought of until it's not on, which means you usually stick with what you know works, because there's so much downside if it doesn't. So that is a reason why we don't innovate willy-nilly, because we have to be right. Nonetheless, the level of innovation in this industry is breathtaking. For us, I'll give you two examples. One is we're investing $500 million taking what I agree with you, we call it enriched water coming into Blue Plains, sometimes up to 1 billion gallons a day. It's full of energy. So we're using this new technique that's never been used in North America. It's the largest installation in the world to generate 13 megawatts of clean, renewable power at our site. We have a partnership with Pepco. They're going to run a power plant. We have partnerships with private firms that are helping us build it, bringing the best technology to bear, and we'll become the largest clean energy source in the Mid-Atlantic at a treatment facility. And I know this is being done around the country. I'll mention, and by the way, that's a 1/3 reduction in our carbon footprint. You're exactly right about power. We're the largest power user for Pepco. It is the largest line item on our budget other than personnel costs because of the amount of power it takes to carry a gallon of water around and realize how heavy it is. We move 100 million gallons a day in drinking water and 300 million gallons a day in enriched water. And that's all pumped with power. It's unbelievable, those takes. I'll give you one other example. You're right about meter reading. We, 10 years ago, put in automatic meter reading in Washington, D.C., so everybody can go online and see their water use. Well, we devised a computer program that automatically notifies our customers if their use goes outside of an existing band. So if they have a leak or something going on in their home, in the short run, that would make us more revenue. But we don't want revenue from a customer that doesn't know they're using the service. That's an angry customer. We do not need angry customers.
Not a happy customer.
So email, text, phone call. We have it automatically blasted out. No one has to do anything. It's just run by the system. We've sent out more than 50,000 HUNA alerts, high-use notification alerts, over the last 5 years. It's our most successful program. It was an innovation at DC, so incredible innovations. Third is finances. There's no question that we need to be more innovative on financial. When you have needs like DC Water, the summary that you said was $700 million. No, DC Water's combined expenditure next year is $1.1 billion between our operating capital program. We're the biggest capital spend in Washington, D.C. Most people don't know that. We're doing the biggest capital projects. It's Metro. Most people don't know that. And it's all being paid for by 95, 97% by customers. I'll give you some of the ideas of our financial innovations. One is we're also issuing patents. We've got several patents. We're going into products. We want to see if we can take these products and start getting revenue back in concert with private firms. We have to do that. Plus, our ratepayers invested in creating the innovation. We need to get revenue back. But on another side, I was in New York last week. We're looking at century bonds. What if we issued a bond for the $400 million we're going to go to markets for this summer? Because the asset we're building has a minimum useful life of 100 years. And is it fair to charge a 30-year tranche of ratepayers for an asset that will be in the ground a minimum of 100 years? Never been done before. We'll have to see whether or not the markets will take it. But that's the kind of innovation we've got to explore. And the fourth is in the whole system. The notion that Tony emphasized, which is how we look at our job creation program. We have something called DC Waterworks, and it's how we're working with a certification program with the University of District of Columbia and others of the jobs that we have in green infrastructure, how the innovations start growing together. You do green infrastructure, that is work that must be done in the city. It is not the sand hogs that are 10 stories underground that go from tunnel to tunnel project. These are folks putting in green streets, green roofs in your neighborhood. And those are jobs that are accessible to people who need them. So we have a program that's designed to expand, one of the biggest now hiring programs in the city. I'll give you another example. There's a lot of conversation that the best reductions now is no longer from Blue Plains, even how big we are. How do we radiate out into the entire Chesapeake to gain reductions that might be in there? Trading schemes where we might be able to fund a reduction up in the suburbs or the agricultural area that's more cost effective than building the next gadget, no matter how innovative we are at Blue Plains. So the areas of innovations are so spectacular that this is just a wonderful place to be, despite the challenges, as I mentioned.
Thanks, George. That was an excellent picture of how vital our water infrastructure is and how it really serves as the backbone of our economy. It's really life-sustaining infrastructure that we all rely on daily. Let me turn to you, Tony, just to maybe share some of your experiences from Cincinnati. What changes are you expecting to see over the next decade?
Well, you know, I first want to say that this discussion has been very rich, and I would agree with what you said earlier, that we need to continue to break down the silos between water, wastewater, and stormwater. We need to continue to break down the silos between public and private utilities, because as we move forward to get to one water, we've got to be able to do that. In Cincinnati, for example, we've done that. We've went to sort of an integration of our water and our wastewater utilities under one administration and one management. And so now you have water, wastewater, and stormwater all as a part of one water. And probably there's a dozen more cities out there, San Francisco, others, New York, others that have that already in place. But it's important as we move forward over the next decade that we look at more integrations between water and wastewater and stormwater. The other thing I would say is that when you think about regionalization, in order for utilities that are serving the urban core communities to survive, we've got to be able to grow our systems. And we've got to be able to work more collaboratively with our neighbors. Does it make sense for a small or a medium-sized utility to make a $20 million investment for lime softening or for filtration when you have source supply or drinking water supply that you can get to that community quite cheaper? So regionalization, I think, is going to be a trend that's going to continue over the next decade. I think that when you look at the term of technology, you know, we're all doing great things from a technology standpoint, but how are we using that technology to create what I would call new business lines? We can no longer just think that we can get revenue from our ratepayers for the water or the wastewater treatment services that we provide. So how do we take that technology and how do we create new business lines to bring in other sources of revenue for the public utility? I know on the private side, you know, they've probably been doing that and thinking about how do we create new business lines, how do we bring in new revenue for quite some time. In the public sector in Cincinnati, we've started doing that. We've started looking at how do we, we're providing customer service and call center service to, for example, Alexandria, Virginia. We're also providing it to Lexington, Kentucky. So that's a new business line that we took on as a utility to bring in additional revenue. How do we take technology that is going to be what I would call smart technology as it relates to how we're viewing and monitoring and operating our systems through real-time controls and SCADA systems, and how do we use that sensors and those new technologies to provide services maybe to operate other systems that are within our region for a large utility. I think those are great challenges that we have, but I think opportunities for us as utilities. And I think the other area that I think that we need to kind of look at is how do we be more collaborative with other things that are already going on in our community. For example, in Cincinnati, we know that the Department of Transportation is doing a lot of rebuild of the interstate system, whether it be I-75 or I-71. And how do we collaborate with them to make sure that we're getting projects done in conjunction with that construction so that it's cheaper for the community that we serve, so that we're not coming back 5 years from now or 10 years from now and trying to do something within our own water or wastewater system. Let's do it and collaborate with those type of agencies now. Understanding the objectives that HUD has from a national perspective on how we create livable and walkable communities. And so that's why the discussion about sustainable infrastructure and green infrastructure is so important, and how do you set up the codes or change the local codes to make sure that you're creating neighborhoods that are livable, walkable, so that you can bring back population to the urban core of our communities, so that you have communities that are really based upon what the community wants to see, what the community wants to have in terms of its own vision. And so our motto is that first of all, you have to be able to leverage the infrastructure investments that you're making. You have to understand the current conditions of the communities that you're serving, whether it be blighted properties, whether it be unemployment. In the urban core America, and you can name it. You can name it Milwaukee, you can name Cleveland, you can name Cincinnati. We have urban core communities that have unemployment of 40 to 50%. So, but we're providing service to that urban core. So why not invest in technology and as George mentioned, a new class of jobs that are going to allow opportunities for the residents that we serve to be put to work. And so I think when utilities are looking out over the next 10 years and the next 20 years, these mega programs that we're doing, we have an opportunity to make a change from a community benefit standpoint. And we also have the ability to have a voice in the social impact and the social outcomes of the communities that we're serving. An example would be there's a lot of discussion about, how do we take the communities that have these high unemployment rate. There's also the issue of recidivism. Folks that, ex-offenders that get out of prison, how do we make sure that, we put people to work, and how do we make sure we take the strain and the pressure off of the law enforcement? Now, there's a lot of cops in town this week for some reason, and some of the frustrations that they talked about last night was the reoffending or the recidivism that they face in their communities. And so utilities can be at the table to be a part of that social discussion on how we address that issue in our communities. So we're reshaping what the role of utilities are in our communities. And I think that now is the opportunity for us to do it because we're at such a critical stage with our infrastructure, and we already know that we have to make those investments. So how do we leverage those investments?
Great. Good answer. Thanks so much for those insights, Tony. It's really refreshing to hear how closely you are working with the communities on the ground, really addressing their specific needs and meeting them where they're at to provide critical services through your water infrastructure. Let's turn now, let's go back to Mark and Ed. We'd love to hear from both of you some more specifics about exactly the kinds of investments that water utilities need and how those investments would help to grow our economy. Maybe, Ed, let's start with you.
Okay. We've talked a lot about this need for, and again, I'd like to preface my suggestions. We've talked about $1 trillion that's needed for infrastructure improvement. It's a huge number, and it's intimidating, but you want to compare it to the implications of not dealing with it. We've got 734, as you'll see in the report that George talked about, that goes, talks about this topic. We have $734 billion in lost sales as a result of impacts to the economy as a result of the water infrastructure. The impact just over the next 6 years to the GDP is about just about $500 million, $416 billion. So you start looking at those numbers, and trillion doesn't look so big. It's still a lot of money, but it doesn't look. I like to think in threes. So let me make three more suggestions in terms of specifics. One is preventive is always better than reactive when you have the opportunity. So the investments and the the developments in metering and detection and monitoring, although it may seem to some like, well, we don't have time to, we don't have the money to spend that now, or we don't have the time to spend that now. That dollar is always better spent in a preventive mode than reactive. The second one has to do with, again, you've heard this referred to as this issue of innovative financing, different ways to do it. The traditional model of rates based on throughput only is difficult. We had another study that we worked on with Columbia University looking at water rates and utilities and looking at different variables with utilities and water rates. And one of the things that we realized is that between 2000 and 2010, on average, utility debt has gone up by 33%, and the water rates have gone up by 23%. And that's an average. Some of the large utilities, and you were a very good example, and I didn't even plan this, some of the very large utilities have seen 100% increases in these parameters. But if you were to say, have we seen 100% improvement in the infrastructure, you would say, well, maybe not. That's the whole reason why we're having this discussion. So we need different innovative models to try and do this, because not only is it a difficult sell to constantly keep raising rates, these studies show that even doing that doesn't necessarily guarantee that it's going to be a one-to-one relationship. So those innovative models will be very helpful. And I actually mentioned one of my earlier comments about looking for different entities with which to partner. You know, there are other potential sources of collaborative investment. My third one is, like I mentioned at the beginning, I'm a geologist, I'm an earth scientist, and I'm a sustainability officer. So I would be remiss if I didn't put forward, in terms of the suggestion, one of the things, and it's already been mentioned before, and that is of leveraging ecosystem services or green infrastructure. And that is using the ecosystem. And there's a couple of very specific reasons. When we talk about green infrastructure, and it's incredibly encouraging to see the exponential uptake and integration of this concept into the water infrastructure. I think, personally, that is going to be, if not the game changer, one of the game changers in terms of really turning around the rate of improvement of water infrastructure. And we tend to sometimes think about green infrastructure and equate that with stormwater management, which is very critical. But green infrastructure helps with wastewater treatment, and it's also source water protection. You know, the ecosystem and nature have been doing this for, nature has been a water manager for billions of years. So it's built up some experience and the ability to do this. We talk about in the built infrastructure innovation in the sense of multifunctional utilities. In other words, utilities that energy, waste, water reuse. The ecosystem has been doing that for billions of years. That's the way it operates. It's multifunctional systems to maximize resources. So we need to think about it this way. And let me kind of wrap that point on going back to my comment I made in the beginning about I came from the Bronx. So my wife is from a little town in the Catskills in upstate New York. And when you live in New York City and you grew up in New York City, particularly in the inner city, upstate New York might as well be Mars. You know, it's way far away, and I don't even know why it's called New York, because it's someplace else. One of the things that was interesting when I met my wife is not far from where her grandmother lived was one of the reservoirs for the New York City water system. And it was mind-boggling to me to understand that the water that in the pipe, that when I was a little kid, to me that's where it came from, actually sourced from close to 200 miles up in the mountains. And that whole story has come around again in my current role, because source water protection, in other words, protecting the ecosystem and let it do the job of maintaining the quality of the drinking water for the most part, so that it minimizes the impact on the built environment, is a significantly better investment. I don't have the statistics out to the 10th decimal point to share with you, but from what I've seen and my understanding of this process, if not in every case, in nearly every case, money invested in ecosystem services, green infrastructure as part of the infrastructure, in terms of dollar per gallon benefit, is always going to get you more bang for the buck than having to build infrastructure. So,
Fantastic. Mark, would love to hear your thoughts on this as well. Makes it easy.
I think picking up on where Ed started, you know, there has been and continues to be the temptation of doing nothing. Because as long as you literally have something coming out of the tap that doesn't smell or have a funny color, and as long as you flush the toilet and it goes away, there's always the impulse to say, well, you know, that the study, the EPA, the engineers, all these utility executives and heads of agencies, they're self-interested, they want to get this done. But there is a real cost to doing nothing. So the investments, there's well proven, there's multipliers of just from an economic driver standpoint, there is a business case to be made for the investment. But if you don't, in human terms, some of the studies suggest that over the next 10 years, if we don't make these investments, you're going to see a loss of not only jobs, but personal income, the order of about $500 billion. So let's say that study is off by 50%. Anybody want to say, well, $250 billion here or there, that's not really big money. It gets back to we're dealing with massive headwinds if we don't do what we should do, and massive benefits if we do what we should do. And well, you know, you've seen from Tony and George, their agencies, American Water sees this across the country. We spend between $900 million and $1 billion a year on our infrastructure. And that is something that we take a lot of time and attention and take very seriously our responsibility to make sure that that is done efficiently, because on the one hand, you have to be very close attention to the rates and the societal impact if the costs get out of hand. So you're walking a tightrope. Those investments can drive community well-being. Without water, there is no life. With clean water, with good wastewater services, with innovative and effective stormwater control, you enhance economic activity. And it's kind of like, why are we still having this conversation? Because it is so evident, but it always comes back to who's going to pay. And that, I think, is what we're trying to spark the national conversation to realize that this is worth paying for.
Great. Well, we've got some outstanding questions from the audience. Thank you to all of you who took the time to share your questions. And let me start in with those. The first question is about green infrastructure. And I know we've talked about it a little bit, but I think we can get into that in a little bit more depth. And the question is specifically about how cost-effective green infrastructure is. And this is actually an issue that the Center for American Progress has been researching as well. We just released a study last month that showed that every dollar that is invested in restoration of coastal areas actually generates $15 in economic benefit. And that ranges from everything it ranges from storm protection, protecting against storm surge and floods, protecting both communities and infrastructure, but also the economic benefits associated with jobs for restoring those areas, tourism, fisheries, and other things. But would love to hear the views of the panel on the cost effectiveness of green infrastructure. George, let's start with you because you mentioned green infrastructure investments. Ken, I know EPA is doing a lot here, and Tony, I just saw you raise your hand. So maybe since there's lots of questions, if you could be succinct in your response, that would be great.
DC Water is very bullish, and I love the comment you made about ecosystem services. My past, prior to joining utilities, one of the longest job I've had in my career is running a watershed association that was nonprofit in New Jersey. So I know Applied Water and American Water so well. And we had been talking the entire time in the watershed world of using the natural systems rather than building it. It's so much more expensive when you build it. And when you use natural systems, you get so many additional benefits along with clean water. So in Washington, D.C., like 750 communities that have combined sewers, the problem we have with combined sewers is when they fill, they overflow. And that's a mixture of stormwater and sewage that's either going to a neighborhood, that was the story I started with, or a river, neither of which is a desirable outcome. So the question is, how do you capture that stormwater so you don't overwhelm your system? Our biggest solution, and usually in most places it's partly this, is the gray infrastructure. Gigantic underground tunnels. There is a machine right now that's drilling up under the Potomac as we speak, 24 hours a day, 6 days a week, larger than a football field in length. It's an unbelievable project, and that's going to be part of it. But we've proposed to EPA to open our consent decree to add a $100 million investment to green infrastructure. I actually see my friends from Pittsburgh United here where they're asking the same question. If you build green infrastructure, we're confident we have the metrics that green infrastructure will absorb rainwater just like a pipe would. But building a big tunnel has exactly the issue we all talk about. It's enormously expensive and nobody ever sees it. And for a giant tunnel for stormwater, it's actually only used maybe 20 days a year, 30 days a year. The entire rest of the time it sits empty. So everyone's paying out this money in their bill for something they don't see and is usually not being used at all. If you build green infrastructure, and by the math, you can show per acre how much water will be absorbed. So you get a quantification. There are water quality benefits to the uptake of the pollutants that otherwise would be in the water that plants use, nutrients to grow. You have air quality benefits to the surrounding area. The jobs are local jobs, not just to put it in, but you need to have someone go back and maintain that green infrastructure over time. Ground level ozone is reduced. Your city is beautified. The notion of drawing people back into the city, which to me is probably the best environmental outcome of all, because anybody who lives in the city drives less, walks more, has at least a smaller ecological footprint, uses up less power. You draw them back to a city by making the city a more desirable place. Think of that benefit of greening the city. This multiple benefit from $1 spent, to me, makes it one of the best dollar options, and we're delighted that EPA has really opened up the playing field to enable us to do this at the municipal level.
You just write them the permit now, Ken.
Well, I haven't been appointed to the bench, so I can't open your consent decree. So, no, thank you, George. I think you really hit on a lot of what's going on within the agency. I very much, it sounds as though you've been reading some of the materials we've been putting together. Either that or you're drafting them for us. I'm not quite sure which one. But I think that, but you're really, I mean, you're spot on. And I think that part of the question when you ask about the cost effectiveness of investing in green infrastructure is that you have to look at beyond simply one item versus another item. I think George is spot on again. If you go with a gray infrastructure route, you tend to have a singular set of benefits associated with that. When you look at green infrastructure, you have a multitude of benefits associated with that, some of which are readily available on the surface. From the areas in which you're in, you have a more livable community, you have generally higher property values, your quality of life can increase in a community, but you also have below ground values. We briefly touched on the fact that if you allow nature to do what nature's been doing for most of nature's life, gee, some of that water that we used to just make sure we got out as soon as possible, it's a source for groundwater recharge. And so for so many communities that are short of water, letting that water go out ultimately to the ocean may not be providing a benefit to anybody. Letting it go through its natural system, of course, can. I think the element of self-sustainability is a great value. While there is some maintenance involved, it's not the same kind of maintenance that's associated with gray infrastructure. But I wanted to touch on one thing that I think is a component of this that has been a part of a lot of today's conversation, and that is when we talk about innovative ways of looking at investments and innovative ways of managing the assets that we have, whether it's George or Tony going to their boards and saying, well, I want to invest X million dollars to do this, and they look at you and say, well, is it going to work and what's my return? I think that what we're really talking about is approaching who absorbs the risk of making these kinds of innovations that we feel are necessary. From the standpoint of the people on the ground, of course, they've got to look at it and they've got to know that it works economically for them, that it's a viable alternative. I think from the agency standpoint, both us and state regulators, we have to look at it and say, are we willing to assume that risk? One of the things in green infrastructure is it's very hard to take a direct, hard measurement and know what results you're going to get. You know, George has a consent decree that says you have to, it's what, 95%?
96.
I'm sorry, 96% reduction. If you change, George can probably get that if he builds massive tunnels and sends that water through Blue Plains or through other treatment. If you go with the green infrastructure route, can you ensure that same result? So there has to be an element of risk that the agency has to be willing to take as it looks at the results that can come from green infrastructure. There's an element of risk from the utility that makes those investments. And I would also suggest that there needs to be an element of risk that has to be evaluated by the people that value that water quality, whether it's the environmental community, the conservation community, the people that fish, whether commercial or recreational. But people all have to balance this, and we have to be aware of it. We have to have that dialogue, and we have to make those decisions as informed and as best that we can. And so, you know, I think that that's just, it's been an element of a lot of today's discussion, but I just wanted to get it out there and acknowledge that that is a central element to all of these investment options.
Great. Tony, you want to share your views on
Yeah,
green
you know, I
infrastructure?
think green infrastructure obviously is something that is beneficial to the communities that we serve. I think every community is different. I mean, we all have a different story and a different purpose of what our challenges are and what green infrastructure means. I think, you know, in Cincinnati, what we did was we try to look at it from a standpoint of it doesn't have to be something that is sort of the low impact type of approach. It could be more of a big bang approach. And so there's investments that we're going to be making as a utility that we call direct impact investments on green infrastructure and sustainable infrastructure. And an example of that is that when we looked at our Lick Run project, we were able to meet the objectives of the consent decree, but we were able to do it at 50% cheaper than the gray solution. Mm-hmm. So from a cost-benefit perspective, as Ken mentioned, you know, we're not only meeting the objectives of the consent decree, but we're building an asset that is bringing an amenity in to create the opportunity for private side investments and livable, walkable communities once we're done with that investment. But then there's opportunities to collaborate with other projects, and we call them enabled impact projects. Whether you're partnering with public school systems or you're partnering with the zoos or other major projects that are going on to deal with that development and from a stormwater management perspective, and partner with them to make sure that you are maximizing what they're doing and also benefiting the runoff that eventually is going to be tributary to an existing CSO. And then finally, the other impact or approach is what we would call inform and influence, where you're going to do projects partnering with communities and neighborhoods so that they understand the type of BMPs or management practices that you're trying to employ so that they can adopt it as a community and say, yeah, that makes sense, whether it's green roofs or whether it's vegetated swales. And when we took that inform and influence approach, it actually allowed us to get the support we needed from the community to do the bigger bang approach to resurface a stream that had been buried for 150 years and design in some water quality principles and features that ultimately was the project that was approved by EPA. So everybody has a different story. Everybody has a different situation. It's all based upon how much CSO volume you have, what is your control that you have to achieve under your consent decree, but it has an opportunity and it can create a new class of green jobs that can be beneficial to the communities that we serve.
Great insights on the cost effectiveness of green infrastructure. We have two questions from the audience that focus on the need for greater investment in water infrastructure, and I'm going to throw them out together and maybe ask Ken and Mark to take a stab at these, and if other folks want to weigh in, that's great. The first question is, if water is so valuable and we are facing a crisis situation, why aren't we talking about the need for significant federal investment in the form of a Clean Water Trust Fund? The federal government is currently talking about reauthorizing the highway fund at $50 billion per year. Why not water? That's the first question. The second question is, almost all public-private partnerships are for treatment plants, yet most of the infrastructure needs are for pipes. How do we get the private sector to help fix the pipes?
Okay. I'll take a stab at that.
Okay.
Before I let the regulator off the hook. So. Taking the second one first, the United States actually, in terms of public-private partnerships, lags behind the rest of the world, and Ed probably knows this better than I do, since we're totally North America-centered. But public-private partnerships, whether they be design, build, finance, operate, or concession, or any other structure, the investment in collection and distribution systems is pretty widespread. In the United States, I think there is, again, it's all part of breaking down these barriers. There's a concern about the, quote, loss of public control of the system. And I think that it's kind of a false fear. I think it's widely acknowledged that water should always be heavily regulated from both an environmental and an economic standpoint. Scarcity pricing of water is not a formula for successful civilization. So with that as a given, I think there is an appetite for patient capital to go to work to address the collection and distribution systems. I think it has a lot to do, and then getting to that second aspect about the federal government, number one, last I looked, the federal government is not either of a mood or an ability to hand out large sums of money. And in fact, I think there is a lot of interest in public-private partnerships in the Congress and in the administration, precisely because they see how do you bring private capital instead of the traditional approach of let's get it from the taxpayer. Taxpayers could seed programs, they could incent, and there could well be a place for an infrastructure bank that deals with water as well. But at the end of the day, I think that getting to actual true cost of service is what we're slowly coalescing around, because we all face that issue. If our customers are really used to paying 20% of the real cost because federal grants or developer contributions or state funding built a lot, or we've been trading on infrastructure that was built in 1898 and it's come due, we need to recognize as a country that we have to start paying what it actually costs and not trying to stick it to the other guy. And so in that regard, I think the Congress could adopt a bank, but unless you're going to heavily subsidize it, it's going to come back to maybe specialized lending, some leveraged federal money to incent, but it's not going to be a magic bullet that's going to make things happen without cost. I hope that addresses
Great. Ken, did you want to weigh in?
Well, I will, and I'll start with the easier part, and that is the pipes question and investments. And I was thinking as you were asking that, several months ago I participated in a discussion that CEQ had put together, and it was looking at ways of creating private sector investment. And not to promote by any means, but one of the things that popped into my head that I never thought of before was the combination of getting coordinated activities. For example, we know that periodically people are out there resurfacing streets, they're tearing up streets. Of course, one of the things that people don't like is when streets are torn up for either utility work or some other repair that has to happen. But if replacement can be coordinated with resurfacing, that's a big plus. But the piece that I thought was really unique was there also an opportunity to tap into the private sector who might be simultaneously interested perhaps in running fiber optic cables under that same street at that same time, where they might be willing to pay a portion of the cost of the investment of digging up that street, replacing or repairing pipes, installing or having fiber optics put in, or some other telecommunications that would be necessary. And of course, you get a new resurfaced street for that. So I think people are thinking about these things, and I know the gentlemen here that are sitting with me and people out there are thinking of these things, and I think that there are some real opportunities. In terms of why isn't there a more significant and robust federal investment? There is, of course, a lot of pressure on the discretionary spending in the budget right now. The trend in discretionary spending has been downward for many years, and those pressures don't come without cuts in some form of investment. Obviously, the administration remains committed to investing in drinking water and wastewater infrastructure through its budget requests each year, and those are formulated in the context of the overall budget in which the agency has to operate within the greater executive branch. But I think that also it should not go unnoticed that the president did early on make a proposal to Congress for an infrastructure bank that was not well received. There has been a lot of discussion about coming up with a self-financing mechanism for a trust fund over many years. I lived through a lot of those conversations when I was on Capitol Hill. The difficulty has always been the revenue source. It seems that every potential revenue source that's discussed, whatever that interest is, says no. And so you tend to be left with general revenues as the source, and so you're looking at a pressure on general revenues. The Highway Trust Fund, the Aviation Trust Fund both have established sources of revenue. We know the Highway Trust Fund is not sufficient from an income standpoint to maintain expenditures, and the President is making proposals on that. And the last point I would make is that I believe that the Congress is about to approve a water infrastructure program called WIFIA, the Water Infrastructure Financing, and I don't remember the last couple, but that's modeled after a program that's been successful in the transportation world. I know that in the water world, that is not a universally accepted proposal, but Congress chose to do what it chose to do, which will provide another funding source potentially for water investment. I think people will want to see how that works. Is it successful? Is it set the tone for, again, more discussion on how to make investments that the federal government's involved in?
Great, thanks. Yeah, let me throw out another question, and then I'm actually going to direct that question to both of you, so you can maybe weave in your infrastructure or your investment response into that. But just, we've got so many great questions. I want to make sure we get as many of them out there as possible. You know, Tony and Ed definitely want you to address this, and George too. How has environmental equity and environmental equity issues come into your work and the work with diverse communities? How has that been addressed, particularly recognizing some of the cultural significance of water for minority communities? And this questioner points specifically to the Anacostia as part of the Underground Railroad. If you could talk a little bit about that, and then feel free to weave in some additional comments on investment. Ed, why don't we start with you?
Okay. I think it's a challenging question because from the water service provider standpoint, our job is to make sure that the community gets the water, and it doesn't matter what from a standpoint of the makeup of the community, we don't want to have that filter the process. So we look for ways to make sure everyone can get what they need to have. So if there are financial issues that come along with that, depending on the economy of a particular, and you try and find ways around that. And this is more for George and Tony in terms of rate programs and that kind of an issue. But from the provider standpoint, from the service provider standpoint, it's a commitment to be as fair as possible to everyone, that kind of a thing. So it was kind of an interesting question because. You want to support the economy and the society that you're serving,
right.
Regardless of what it is. I want to make a comment about the previous thing. I hate when Congress does that, where you get asked one question, you answer something else, or in the TV debates. But I wanted to point out something very important because yesterday I was in New York talking to a group of industry folks, and a big potential source of investment that can really help finance, that really introduce additional potential financing is the private sector industry, not the private sector water providers I'm talking about private sector industry, manufacturing and so on. They are very aggressively looking at the monetized risk exposure of the water issues. And the reason they're doing that is they're trying to figure out what is the best investment to minimize those risks. And that's an opportunity for the private and the public sector to get together and say, look, you guys, whether it's Coca-Cola or Boeing or whatever, you have concerns about water availability and you're figuring out what those impacts are to you that if you didn't have that water, if you didn't have it as efficiently as you need it. And you're going to invest in that because that's what you do. You invest in risk and minimizing your risks. There might be a way to do that. That might be more cost effective on a grander scale in working with the public infrastructure, and at the same time, the community benefits. Happens in the developing world on a regular basis. Coca-Cola is building water systems and Unilever is building treatment plants, but we don't think about it that way because we just, again, we think we have a very mature system. The other point I want to make on this potential sources of innovative financing and source of capital is if you start thinking about the watershed as the picture. So you have treatment plants and supply plants and pipes crisscrossing, and over here there are farms, and over here there's industry, and everything is kind of feeding into a given watershed. If you start to think more holistically about the health of the watershed, then everyone kind of finds their place, and there might be investments that others are willing to do, irrigation practices or some other kind of approach, which indirectly reduces the load and the burden on a given finite gray infrastructure, and it might help maybe not necessarily feed money into that particular place, but alleviate some of the need for a certain amount of capital to offset a particular problem. You know, we operate treatment plants, and we're very concerned about the outflow of that pipe, and we monitor it, and we do what we can, and as we're doing that around us, all this stuff is flowing into the river or the lake because of non-point source and surface runoff. And we have to kind of look at this big picture. You know, what is the best bang for the buck?
Great.
Thank you.
I'll be very quick, but on the investment question, those of you who are asking about investment on the pipe side, I don't see that it's worth it for the big systems to spend a lot of time thinking of private investment taking over some ownership interest. It just causes more grief than is necessary, and we're very committed to public ownership. We have a tremendous amount of private investment in our system already through the municipal bond market. I mean, the largest and fastest growing part of our revenue stream is this, and our expenses are the money we pay out to bondholders who are long-term investors, mostly from the private sector. Where we seek the private sector and work with both of the companies that are here on the stage is when you're so deeply involved with delivering service to your place, it is hard to stick your head up and see what's the best out there from around the world. And that's what our private sector partners can deliver to us. I want to know what's the best in the world, and I just know what's going on out in K Street. So the question is, how can the private sector bring the best to deliver? We can have them do well by doing good, by paying them to bring that kind of knowledge to any one place. On the equity side, I think it's one of the most important issues that urban systems face. In Washington, D.C., in most cities, unfortunately, where the treatment facilities are located, where our big pump stations are located, where public works is located, is often in lower income neighborhoods. So not only have these neighborhoods not taken the benefit, they're often taking the consequence of a lot of the work that we do. So there's always been the challenge of these neighborhoods, plus those are often the last places where urban renewal, that's a lousy term, vitality is coming, like the Anacostia, which is, to me, not only a fairness question, they're also a huge part of our customer base and their potential labor force. So the reasons that we want to make sure that the expenditures we're making is benefiting the people we serve on an equitable basis, it's the right thing to do. It's also where our facilities are, and it's where the best job creation can implement. And then those are people who turn back around and support us when we go back and say, this is what we're seeking from you from terms of rate or the other support we need. So it's absolutely a primary goal of an urban system like ours to be very aware and sensitive to those questions.
Thanks, George. Tony, can you tell us a bit about how you're dealing with equity issues in Cincinnati?
Well, you know, I think I would start by saying, and then this is just sort of a qualifier for what I'm going to say, is the Department of Commerce says that for every dollar we invest in infrastructure, we create another $2.62 in our local economy. And for every job that we create about 3.6 additional jobs in our economy. So if that is true, I mean, when you think about the investments that we're making, and for example, in Cincinnati, we're saying then we're going to make a $3 to $4 billion investment over the next 20 years. So what is the return on that investment from a local economy perspective, and what is the return in terms of the jobs that are going to be created with the program that we do? Nationally, I think that, you know, water utilities are in a unique position. And I think that in Cincinnati we're in a unique position because collectively between water and wastewater, you know, we're investing about $300 to $400 million a year in our capital program. So from an equity perspective, I mean, we have to try to see how we can, number one, do projects that are going to benefit the community. We have to understand the job impact There's a lot of debate about how, what type of policy or what type of procurement guidelines need to be in effect to make sure that we are actually getting the outcomes that we're achieving, whether that's having apprenticeship programs or having local hire conditions in the procurement process. I mean, those things are being debated right now in Cincinnati. That is the policy debate. Is it legal to do it? Should we do it? I mean, so the question is we got to make sure that, you know, whatever we do is ultimately going to be a positive outcome for the communities that we're serving. And as George mentioned, a lot of the facilities and a lot of the projects that we're doing in the urban core systems with the combined sewer systems, we have a very, very serious issue with blighted property. And we have a very, very serious issue with vacant property. And so as we make investments, you know, what is the collaborative approaches that we need to take so that we are rebuilding those communities so that, you know, they're, from a social justice perspective, we're making an investment that ultimately is going to, 20 years from now or 40 years from now, when, you know, our children or our grandchildren look back and say, are we making the right investments? And, you know, from my perspective, that really is the true definition of sustainability, making the right investments at the right time to benefit a generation down the road. And so, you know, I think that, you know, as that debate continues about what is legal and what we should be doing, we have examples of other programs that are going on in San Francisco, for example, that's creating over 36,000 jobs in the rebuild of the water and the wastewater system. You have Los Angeles that is creating the same amount of jobs in doing, you know, the rebuild of their systems. So when you put all of those together, we as utilities have the ability to make an enormous change to what's going on in the, from a social justice perspective and what the return on that is for the communities that we serve.
Fantastic. I think we have time for one more set of questions. There's actually a number of questions related to climate change, and I'm going to throw them out together. The first question, maybe George, I'll ask you to take a stab at, but others are welcome to address as well. What steps are water and wastewater utilities taking to disclose to their potential bond purchasers the financial risks of climate change? Another question, how are urban water utilities working with rural water utilities? And Tony, maybe this is something you could address, but in particular in light of the fact that climate change is impacting agricultural productivity across the country and that urban areas, large cities, are dependent economically on the surrounding agriculture as well as sharing the watershed with rural communities. There's that piece. And then the last question, given the magnitude of probable impacts of climate change on water and wastewater utilities, what role are the utilities assuming in educating the Congress on the issue of climate change? Maybe George and Tony, you could talk about that a little bit when you respond. But this is something we've been looking at the Center for American Progress as well. We published a report last year, at the end of last year, called Climate Change, the Unfunded Mandate, which basically tried to quantify the costs that cities are facing to cope with the impacts of climate change, both on water utilities, but also in terms of flooding, heat waves, all sorts of other impacts that are affecting urban communities. And the fact that Congress is failing to act on climate change is actually imposing an unfunded mandate on cities to deal with these very large costs to prepare for the impacts of climate change on the ground. But why don't we, George, maybe you could talk a bit about the disclosure issue.
Sure. Well, it's a fantastic question, and it allows me to go back to where I started, which was the story about that flood on Florida Avenue. It's interesting when you're in our role where we're operators. There's all sorts of debate goes on about climate change and the pros and cons. As a practical reality, in the street, we're seeing more extreme weather.
Oh, yeah.
I can put aside what the cause, what the science, it's the realities we see it. That flood that I mentioned early on was the fourth flood in 2012 of its kind. We never had 2 in any one year in the last 60 years, and we had 4 in 1 year. As anyone who runs a system knows, what extreme weather events mean is that the cycle of either drought or extreme rain is higher at either end. And you can have them both in the same year. And systems are at their worst and most expensive when you're dealing with extremes. You don't have enough or you have too much. We do really well if you know your quantities in the middle. So as the system goes to the edges, the costs are unbelievable. The project that we are now undertaking to solve that flooding problem in the center of Washington, D.C. costs us $700 million. $700 million, and all we're doing is expanding the capacity of a sewer system that's 100 years old to handle this enormous fluctuations. That's more money than DC will put in schools for the next 5 years for their capital program for one area of the city for one issue. Do we disclose this to our bondholders? Absolutely. In most of our systems, we also have treatment facilities, at least on the enriched water side, that are at the lowest part of the city, because you want all the flow to come to you as best as it can by gravity, so you don't have to spend money to pump it all the way down. But that means you're in the low point, the hydraulic low point, so the most risk to flooding is at Blue Plains. So we're building a 250-year flood wall at enormous expense to protect ourselves from a rising Potomac. Again, whatever the cause, it's rising, and so we're going to have to handle the consequence. We put out disclosure to our bondholders of the risks we see over time, but also the very aggressive steps we're taking to respond to those risks, because in fact, a lot of the money that we're seeking from our bondholders is in fact to solve the risk that we're disclosing in the very bond itself, which is these questions of extreme weather events. They're an enormous challenge on every front, but you do see it first in the water systems.
Great. Tony, did you have anything you want to add to that?
Well, as George said, obviously the investments that we're making, obviously we have to disclose, to our bondholders the issues of risk and climate change issues and how that impacts the operation of our facilities going forward. I think I would also want to kind of talk a little bit more about the piece that what are we doing with working with more rural or systems. And I think that when you think about the issues beyond just dealing with CSOs and the issues of dealing with phosphorus and nutrients and all of that, I mean, obviously that impacts us from a watershed perspective. From a watershed perspective, we cannot just isolate on the localized issue. We have to examine the entire watershed, and when you examine the entire watershed, you find that there are, other, what we could say, non-point source factors that contribute to nutrient control and those type of things. And so there's a lot of discussion about the investments that we're making. Are they really making a change and improving water quality? A lot of the CSO initiatives and the SSO initiatives are focused on E. coli and how do we reduce bacteria. But there's broader issues of nutrients where, folks are really saying, are we really making a change in water quality, or are streams meeting water quality standards by making these billion-dollar investments? The answer to the question is that we're not meeting water quality standards once we make these billion-dollar investments. So what do we need to do about that as utilities? And I think that, the conversation really needs to shift to more of a watershed approach. And how are we making investments that are not only dealing with E. coli or bacteria, but dealing with other nutrient issues that are really going to be, in the long term, better for the aquatic life in our streams and our rivers. And so we have to take a broader view, more of a watershed approach of planning, and whether that's, the use of a model that is more of a sustainable approach, or a model that is more focused specifically on just water quality outcomes. That is the big issue that we have to collaborate on upstream in dealing with rural water agencies or dealing with the agricultural community to see how the ultimate impact is. And when we have these issues that we have to address, particularly with the pending or the discussion about future stormwater regulations focused on water quality for nutrients, we have to have a broader view of the investments we're making now, and will they all be working towards the common goal of improving water quality in the future.
Great, thanks for that answer. I'm afraid we've run out of time, so we need to bring the conversation to a close. We didn't get to the question about how to educate Congress on the impacts of climate change. Ken, you're doing your part by you and your colleagues at across the federal government by releasing the National Climate Assessment last week, which actually is a report that is mandated by Congress. And so let's hope they act on it. I want to thank all of you in the audience for being with us here today and for sharing some excellent questions, and for those who are watching at home via webcast. I want to say that there's a great report that a lot of us have been referring to throughout the panel. It's called Invisible to Invaluable, which was prepared for this discussion. It's on the event website. And you can visit that website, The Value of Water, www.thevalueofwater.org, to get more information, to get the report and more information about the Value of Water campaign. I want to turn it over to Ben Grumbles now to close the discussion.
I just want to say a few words of thanks to all of you. Glover Park Group, Meridian Institute, who was very instrumental in the formation and the ongoing work of this Value of Water Coalition. All of the dynamic panelists, national leaders in their own right. As Kathleen said, I want to direct all of you to the website, thevalueofwater.org. And the last thing is to simply remember this. When you hear the phrase, all water is local, don't just let the conversation stop there. The benefits are local, they transcend local. We as a country would not have a Clean Water Act or a Safe Drinking Water Act if it was just left there. It's local and more. And the best thing we can do as a coalition of public and private water leaders and organizations is to get out the information, have an effective public awareness campaign to help local leaders do more, to build new partnerships, and to invest in water's future. Thank you all so much. Enjoy the rest of Infrastructure Week and do your part. Thank you.